Hello, Garland Nixon here, and we're hanging out with Peter Erickson from, or rather, the co-host of Conversations Amongst the Ruins. Let's talk. Hello, Garland Nixon here, and we're hanging out with Peter Erickson, and he's got a great channel, Conversation Amongst the Ruins. If you haven't been living under a rock by now, I'm sure you're not only familiar with the channel, but you're probably subscribed. And if neither of those is true, you want to take care of all three. Conversation Amongst the Ruins, Peter with his son, Charlie. What a great, one of my favorite channels. At any rate, let's get going. You know, something has happened here that's consistent. I'll use that word, Peter. That is, you know, every time the U.S. and the U.S. and the Russians would say we're going to have a meeting and we'll drag the Ukrainians in to talk about a peace deal. And of course, the night before there'd be drone attacks and terrorist attacks and trains blowing up and all those. That like to send the message, we're not doing this, and we've got to send you a message. It ain't happening. Okay. So recently, the Russians have said, look, in order to get a deal, you're going to have to guarantee the rights of Ukrainians, as far as Russian-speaking Ukrainians, as far as their heritage, their history, their religion, etc. And let's see, here's what we have now. Kiev has taken another step towards banning the Ukrainian Orthodox Church by officially declaring it linked to Russia. Look, here's the truth about a fight. Sometimes Trump might have been right. Sometimes you just got to let them fight it out. And it looks like the only thing that the Ukrainians will ever accept, if you're an ultra-nationalist, we'll use that word, that phrase, the only thing you accept is going to be is to be defeated. It looks pretty clear.
Yeah, no, that seems obvious. I mean, Zelensky, he didn't start out this way, but he's become an ultra-nationalist. You know, he's pretty much drunk the Kool-Aid and is one of them now. He has not budged, from his demands, essentially that the Russians retreat from every single millimeter of territory, go back to, 1991 Ukraine, pay trillions of dollars in reparations, put Putin on trial for war crimes. I haven't heard so much of that stuff recently, but everything else, and forget about, try to keep us out of NATO. We're going to be part of NATO. So in other words, just capitulation on part of the Russians. So, there's all this talk about progress towards some sort of settlement and, maybe arranging a meeting between Zelensky and Putin. But it's just meaningless because Zelensky's not budging. He's occasionally you hear some sort of rumor that maybe, or that they are starting to adjust their position. Ukrainians are, or maybe Zelensky says something that might be interpreted as a softening of his position. But then, the next day he makes it clear he hasn't changed. So yeah, we're not, they are not going to do anything, to take a step towards any sort of settlement. They are committed to fighting this to the bitter end, even though it's obvious that they're losing, and they will lose. It's, well, on one level, I think I can understand it, looking at it rationally and objectively, coolly, it doesn't make any sense. They should make a deal now. But the problem is they're in this so deep, and they have lost so many of their men already, that it's virtually impossible for them to walk away and say, oops, we made a mistake. We should have taken that deal, actually the Minsk Accords. If they would have only lost Crimea, that's it. Okay, well, we missed the Minsk Accord. We could have done the Istanbul Agreement. They just would have lost the two oblasts of the Donbass. That's it. But now we're talking about hundreds of thousands of deaths. We don't know about this possibly 1.7 million on dead and missing. That may actually be true. We don't really know yet, but it's a big number. And so now are you going to say, oops, I'm walking away from this? I don't think Zelensky or anybody in the Kiev regime can do that. I mean, so the only thing, and that would be the rational thing to do, but that's the emotionally, impossible thing to do. So it's just plow ahead and pray for a miracle. At some point it'll all be worth it. Something will happen, some black swan event, or the US and NATO will come to our rescue, and or Russia will collapse, or all those things will happen, and then we win. And they're just pinning their hopes on that miracle, which will never happen.
And there's another way to look at it too, and that is that's making an argument that to any extent at all, to some extent, Ukraine has agency, right? But what if we take another perspective? Because there are various ways to look at this, right? You can look at it as Ukraine should have taken this deal or that deal. There's an alternative perspective to look at it, and that is that they never had agency, that they were always a proxy pawn for the US empire, right? So that under this perspective, they had no opportunity to take the Minsk Accords. There's a guy named Andrei Telezhenko that was part of the Ukrainian government. And basically, he's been a whistleblower. And what he said was, look, when I was there, if you wanted to bring somebody into the US government, to the Ukrainian government, and you wanted to appoint somebody, you had to go to the Americans, and then they would call Washington, and Washington would call back and say yes or no. If you wanted, Washington would call you and say, no, this person's going in here, that person's going in there. We're getting somebody ready. Don't worry about that position. We're going to send somebody there. In other words, it was fully owned, run, and according to him, and he worked with Blue Star Strategies. He worked with Biden, all of that. And he said, look, they completely controlled things. Okay. Yeah. Which would mean this. They could have never taken the Minsk Accords because they didn't have the agency to do it. That at that time, they were completely under the control of the U.S. So they didn't have an option of taking the Minsk Accords, because they didn't have the agency. They were being prepared for sacrifice at that time. Right. Okay. When the Istanbul, hey, we want to take it. Nah, you can't. So again, they were still being prepared for sacrifice, and there were plans of how they would be used. And ultimately, what we're looking at is imperial plans that failed. So it's like, okay, we'll use them for this. Oh boy, we'll take the Russians out. Oh darn, that didn't work. What do we do now with this thing that we've prepared, with this weapon that we've prepared to beat the Russians over the head with it? We still got this weapon. How else can we use? We wanted to beat them over the head, and we wanted to use economic sanctions, and that didn't work. What now? So they're just now. Its patron is kind of in flux, saying, let's try to use them this way. Let's try to use them that. Now they're fighting amongst each other. Well, you've got to come in and fight them. The U.S., hey, we ain't going to come in and fight them. You go fight them. We ain't paying for it. You pay for it. So now you've got a fight behind the scenes of the proxies and the patrons who put this plan together. And the Russians didn't quite go along with the plan, shall we say. Right. And now they've been stuck with this mess, and they don't really know how to get out of it. What do you think?
Well, I think the Russians were supposed to just kind of roll over and, die. They were supposed to collapse. That was their assigned role. It's just
they didn't read their lines, huh?
Yeah, that's right. They're supposed to be. I think that a lot of these people are just stuck in the 90s. When it was just easy to kick around the Russians, and you didn't have to really pay attention to the Russians because they might complain, but in the end they always had to cave in because, hey, you're the mighty West, and they're just the pathetic Russians, just like basically the rubble left over from the Soviet Union. But it didn't work out that way. They hadn't noticed things had changed, those better than 20 years under Putin. Russia was not the Russia that it was then. So Russia didn't roll over, didn't collapse. And we are where we are now, and they just, they're having trouble coming to terms with it. So, I think, I don't know exactly where to draw the line. I think you're right. There's no question about it. The patrons have a great deal of say. The proxies, they're, I think they got a little bit of agency, but not a whole lot. One thing is, but that tells you that it's, okay. When you look at Ukraine, you got the ultra nationalists, and they're committed to it. I don't think they're being forced to do that. Right. This is something that they really believe in. But why are those ultra nationalists in power? It's because the patrons have supported them, and the patrons could put an end to it. It's just like if Trump and the Europeans got together and said, "That's it, not another bullet for you guys. Not another euro, not another dollar." Within maybe seconds or hours, they might just give up, or at least there would be some sort of crisis and a new government would have to be reconstituted, because Ukraine could not survive very long at all, without the support. So the fact that they're going ahead with this, it shows that the patrons are committed to this as well. And it doesn't really make sense for anybody, at least of all for the Ukrainians. They're the ones that are dying. And then for the patrons, well, you look at the leaders, maybe, they're just thinking of their political careers. To the extent that they're actually aware and understand what's going on, they're thinking, man, this is a disaster. But if we can just keep them afloat until my term ends or whatever, then it'll be somebody else's problem. Maybe that's what they're thinking. But I kind of worry, though, a lot of them are just so deluded, that they really... they really do believe that somehow, they're still in the 90s, even though Russia did not collapse. We just have to be, one more sanctions package or whatever. We just got to kick them one more time. They just can't give up on that fantasy. They just can't do it. They're incapable of doing it.
I remember hearing a person say something one time that made me shake my head, and they used this term. It's back when I was working in law enforcement, and they were in my office, and I said something. They said, "I refuse to believe that." I'll never forgot that, because they didn't say, "I don't believe it."
Yeah.
They said something very different. And I think that's what we're looking at. I never forget that. I refuse to believe.
Right.
I won't believe it. You're implying that the information is there to support that, but it doesn't work for you. You got big problems if you believe that. And I think, not that it really matters, but I think we're looking at it. Is it delusion, or is it, oh, for God's sake, I can't let this thing go? You know what I mean? I got to hold on. I can't do this. I'm so screwed if that happens. Right. So I have to hold on for any number of reasons. I believe this. I believe I'll throw something else that's maybe cultural in there. I think that, say, a Starmer and a Meritz in some of these clowns, I think they have that Europe is the garden and every place is the jungle, right? These Slavs are below us. They're slaves. They never have the authority to tell us what to do. They must accept that we tell them what to do and that they do it. They are genetically, intellectually, philosophically, and dare I say, culturally inferior to us. And I don't care who has the power. They have to accept they're betters. And I do believe, though that's not discussed much, particularly for the Russians for the Germans and the Brits, ruling elite, that there is a certain level of we are superior to them. And for us to say they beat us, for us to say we came and we had a brilliant plan and we were going to take them out, doggone it, we lost. That punches a hole in that these Slavs are inferior to us stuff. Right. And we can't accept that. No matter what, we'll go to our grave saying we can never accept that Slavic people who are not Anglo-Saxon imperial ruling elite people. That would be like saying the Littles, this person that has a Cockney accent and walks down the street in London, singing cockles and muzzles or something, that person has a right to be in our presence. We endure their existence. So no, I think there's some of that there, believe it or not.
Yeah, no, I don't disagree at all. Yeah, I think it's a lot more than just some sort of cold geopolitical calculation. I just we're just much more powerful than them, and then oops, we got that wrong. No, it's something deep down there. It's like an article of religious faith for them. I think that's become clear. It's just right. It's just that we are the garden. We are the good ones. We are the empire of good, and therefore anybody that resists us is evil. We are morally superior. And at the same time, yeah, NATO, let's not forget, that's the most powerful military alliance that the world has ever seen. You know, it's in every sphere of human existence, we are superior. I think that this was just it wasn't, you know, sometimes it's stated openly. You get some of these leaders to say something like that, but I think it's just something that it was understood. It didn't even need to be stated. It was just known as a fact to all these people. And yeah, that's why this is not, you know, if there were rational people who are just trying to pursue maybe geopolitical interests, you know, that's part of it. But I think it's much more than that. If it was just that, they can make adjustments to their policy. Say, okay, yeah, okay, we overestimated our strengths, underestimated the Russians. You know, let's try to maybe recalibrate here somewhat. But it's something they're unable to do. It's just because this, again, is an article of faith. And if they let go of this, it just, their whole world comes crashing down. There's just sense of, you know, what is good, what is right, you know, who, you know, where their role in the world. It's they, you know, I guess over the decades, this sort of this sense of superiority, you know, this Western supremacism has become so deeply entrenched that they don't have any kind of alternative thinking, you know, that they're capable of switching over to, you know, so they're just going to crash in some form, you know, one way or another. You know, when the victory of Russia in this war becomes completely indisputable, you know, that's going to come crashing to the ground. You know, I just, hopefully they don't bring us all down with them. When they get, hopefully the best thing is that they get thrown out of office, you know, through elections, and that might happen, you know, because in general, it's really not so much, you know, the philosophy of the average European, but it's clearly, it's the worldview of the elite there. And, you know, maybe I think the thing that we can hope for again is that the average European will just throw the bums out. There's some reason to be somewhat hopeful, but you know, it may not turn out that way.
Well, it explains a von der Leyen, or God knows a Kaja Kallas, going to the Chinese and reading them the Riot Act. You know, I mean, going to you're from a country the size of a neighborhood in Brooklyn or Queens.
Right.
You know, you're from a country that, I mean, you got like nothing there. And you're going to China, reading them the Riot Act, and they're like, really? Okay, well, goodbye, little person, go away, you know? And they're like, oh, well, we told those Chinese, we put them in their place, we return to Europe. And you're like, you know, just shocked. But to them, they're like looking at each other, shaking hands and high-fiving, and yes, sir, we put the Russians and the Chinese in their place. And you're like, you're sitting there trying to figure out how they could be so, but they have a mindset. And I do think this, interestingly enough, I think the Americans are different for different reasons. But if you look at history, the Americans, they use proxies. And when they're done with them, I've said this from the very beginning, they use the Samsonite option. Not the Samson option. They pack their bags and get the hell out of town. America's history is we set up a proxy, we use the proxy with like an avatar, and when somebody beats the hell out of the proxy, punishes it, beats it, tears it to pieces, yanks his arms and legs off, well, sucks to be you. We turn around and leave. So the Europeans don't get that the Europeans are like, we will stand with Ukraine to the end. And the Americans are like, yeah, that ain't the way we do things. They were always, the term that we use is cannon fodder. Do you understand? We ain't dying over cannon fodder. We're not giving up New York in exchange for Kiev. We ain't giving up Sheboygan in exchange for the Kiev. It's not going to happen. We're finished with them. You can have them. Have a nice day. And the Americans are never going to send troops on the ground. No fly zones, no nothing. We're finished with it. And all the Americans are looking for is a way to get the hell out. Our history says we don't give a crap about Kiev. Embarrassment, anything else, the Americans don't care. The Americans will walk away.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, there's a small chance that it won't happen. You know, that again, the pressure, you know, again, I don't want to make any firm predictions about.
Right, of course,
yeah, especially about Donald Trump and what he's going to do. But I think you're right. I think we're we're going to do what we've done before, as you said, the Samsonite option. We're going to walk away. It's easy to do. I mean, the thing is that we're way over on the other side of the world. It's like, what? Vietnam? I never heard of the place. Afghanistan, what? These places are far, far away. We just retreat to our, hemisphere, and then we find another fight, and we just sort of like somebody who keeps on falling in love, and just forgot about the last one. But this is the real one. This is the one we're gonna, and it's going to be as long as it takes, and there's going to be flags waving and everything, and then. Yeah, that's not working out too well. Let's find another one.
Hey, look, Taiwan. I think they need some democracy and freedom. You know what I mean? That's it. That's what America will do. America will say, Taiwan, I think we need to send them some weapons and go talk to them about standing up against China. I don't recall Ukraine. I'm not familiar with the term. I haven't heard it in a long time. Let's move on. They will leave everyone holding the bag. Well, in the words of the tuna, the famous coach of the New York Giants, and this is I always say the safest bet is consistency. But the way he put it was, you are what your record says you are. If you want to know what the Americans will do, you go ask the North Vietnamese. You go ask the people in Afghanistan who the United States said, okay, you work with us and we'll help you get out of the country. And thanks. Oh yeah, well, sure, we got you covered. Absolutely great. They were dangling off the fuselage of a C-130 as the plane took off. They're holding on. Help! Sorry, get out of here, pal. We are done with this. It should be a message to the people, the traitors that always help us. Every single time we leave them holding the bag. And you know what else? And we will leave the Europeans holding the economic bag.
Yeah, well, we can see that happening already. I mean, that's we're still sending weapons, but supposedly the Europeans are paying for it, right? I mean, that's kind of the first step. And of course, the Europeans are hoping that, this is just Donald Trump. If we can keep the war going for another 3 years, then we'll have a Democrat in office, and we'll be just back to, like the good old days. But I think, again, you're right. This is, even if it's a Democrat who comes, I think the process is in place. The logic is there. The pattern's been established. We're moving out. This is clearly become a drain on American resources. We're losing the war. It's not looking good. Let's find something else to divert ourselves with. But
and here's the thing.
Yeah,
here's the thing about it. If they're hoping for a Democrat, have you seen the Democrats polling lately?
I know it's abysmal. It's pretty bad for Trump, but I think it's even worse for the Democrats.
Their money, the DNC has like 15 million and the Republicans have 80 million. So nobody's giving them money. They're losing. People are literally leaving the Democratic Party and either becoming independents or going to the Republican Party. Everything about, I put it like this: if their plan is to wait for a Democrat to win, and they're talking about running like Gavin Newsom or one of these clowns, Steve Buttigieg, right?
Yeah.
If their plan is to wait for a Democrat to get in office, that ain't a good plan. I'm just saying that ain't a good. I'm a recovering Democrat. That ain't a good plan. I know a lot of people who haven't recovered. They're still pissed over Gaza.
Yeah, for good reason. They may end up with J.D. Vance. And remember the he gave him a speech that just they're probably still haven't gotten over. Right?
I think he'd be. I don't know that he doesn't want war with China or God only knows what. But one thing for sure, he's more so than Trump. He hates Europe and he wants nothing to do with Ukraine.
Yeah. And
Trump's got health problems and he's like 80 years old. Forget the next one. There ain't no guarantee that J.D. Vance. Right. If I had to wager, if somebody said, bet, will Trump finish his term, I'd probably, if I had to put, okay, Garland, here's $1,000. You got to bet on something. I'd bet that he wouldn't. Yeah, well, and you're right. They shouldn't, even if Trump does finish his term, J.D. Vance is going to be running in what is it now? I forget. It's 2028. 2028, yeah.
Right, exactly, 2028. And again, the Democrats, I think in a normal universe, they should win, because again, so much of what I'll be honest, that Trump has done has been a disaster. I mean, he's not even, a lot of his base is upset with him,
Yeah. And he's
well,
going to start another war, possibly.
Yeah, right.
He's threatening Venezuela. He's threatening Iran.
Yeah, and again, and I understand his popularity ratings are underwater, but the Democrats are even worse. and so it just may be, again, that we could just, no matter, even if he makes it through these 4 years, we could have JD Vance, and it'll be even worse for the Europeans. And they should be, they should be working on trying to become some sort of independent power. We're talking about like what, 450 million people,
Yes.
Yeah, if you put them all together, they should be a major force on the world stage. And instead, they just made themselves into just kind of the most pathetic, bootlicking, just embarrassments. And the whole world is looking at them, shaking their heads, and just kind of embarrassed, looking away. It's like, do you need to act like this? They blow up your pipelines. They slap new tariffs on you, and then they change the rules of the game on the war that they got Europe into. Because let's be honest, like if you go back to what was it, 2008, it was when it was at that conference where
Budapest.
Yeah, exactly right. It was actually the Europeans were trying to resist. They didn't want. They understood it would be a huge mistake to announce that Ukraine and Georgia were going to be in NATO. But the Americans twisted their arms. They pushed them there. They kept on pushing them, and now they're here, and now the Americans are going to walk away. Another example of the Samsonite option, right? And it's just, they're just fools. They should, they should wake up and say, okay, it's time for Europe to have an independent foreign policy. It's time to join the multipolar world. And within that polar world, we would be a major pole. We're talking about 450 million people, even though, okay, our economies are kind of stagnating, but we're still a prosperous part of the world. We can make a difference. We can grow, we can connect with all the rest of the world, and we don't have to be a vassal of the US engaged in this ridiculous proxy war against Russia that's hurting us so much. But they're just absolutely incapable. They're still, living in the past, and they still believe in that vision of American-led hegemony, and they just can't let go, and it's destroying them.
Yeah, it's the whole concept. I mean, you look at France; they had the Sahel. I read somewhere that it's estimated they stole $50 trillion in wealth from over the course of, but look how long they've been. You've been there for a century or two, stealing gold, all of their uranium, that kind of money sounds, you know what I mean? And they still have several countries that they're still robbing blind, right? Mm-hmm. Giving literally 1% of the country, literally gets like 1% of the income. Mm-hmm. So, and this is what really infuriates them, the rise of Russia and China as alternative poles, as alternative economic options, means they can't do that anymore. Right. It means they can't hold on to their colleagues anymore. They can't do the things that they did for domination anymore. And there's other options for these countries that says, forget you, I'll make a deal with Russia or China, which means rather than change with the new world, well, we got to take out Russia and China. You waited. I got to be frank about it. If I'm honest with it, you waited too late.
Yeah,
you're right. You waited too late. You waited until they got far too powerful. You were beating up your little brother when he was 12 and you were 13. Now you woke up and you're 16 and he's 15, but he's 6'5" and he weighs 220 pounds and he outgrew you. And you reach for your brother and he picks you up, slaps you around, and he ain't your little brother anymore. He's twice your size. I think that's what happened. They waited too long, and there's no economic option, and they don't really. They're like, we're going to cut you off. You can't buy this from that person, and we're going to sanction you. And the Russian, China, and these countries are like, yeah, sure, no problem.
Yeah. Well, yeah. No. The recent history has demonstrated that, it's just in a crystal clear fashion. I've said before that Trump actually just arrived too late. If he was president 20 years ago, he could get away with all this stuff. He could impose the secondary sanctions on China, and China would just have to cave in, because back then they were too dependent. But like you said, they are no longer, the weaklings. They are as strong or stronger than the U.S. And I think two events in particular just revealed this to us, made it crystal clear. First of all was the the imposition of sanctions, the sanctions from hell against Russia. And there it was. They were so sure that that was just going to crush Russia, that Russia would just collapse in short order. And again, the ruble's going to be rubble and all. And the whole world was looking at it. And I'm sure, Africa, Southeast Asia, South Asia, Latin America, they're all looking and they're just wondering, what's going to happen? I guess the Russians are going to be crushed. And the Russians stood there. They suffered a fairly minor recession that year, 2022, and then came roaring back and stronger than ever. And the whole world looked at that and said, wait a second. Hey, the world has changed. The hegemon, tried to crush its adversary, and the adversary is stronger. Hey, we've got options now. And then the other thing, of course, was the trade war against China. And say, okay, we're slapping 145% sanctions. They're going to, and basically what happened is panic began to grow within the U.S. among the economic elites. It's like, hey, the shelves are going to be empty. We're not going to have the rare earths to make any of our military gizmos here. You got to do something quick. He said, I think we'll just kind of back down on that. And then you notice with all that talk, the tough talk of there was going to be 100% sanctions that Trump was going to impose on China. Well, he panicked and we ended up in Alaska and we don't even talk about it anymore because I think the people around him said, hey, we can't do that. It doesn't work. And so, yeah, we're in this new world and anybody who's paying attention, and I think most of the world is paying attention, realizes, hey, it's over. It's basically over, Western hegemony. It's just like the hegemon himself can't bear to admit it. And is looking away, still is boasting and still throwing his weight around, but they've noticed that it's just it's show, it's bluff.
It's WWF. Well, they didn't. It's amazing. There was an old saying: "Don't march on Moscow, don't bluff Beijing," and they did it both. They did them both. And well, now let me ask you this. I was just thinking something the other day. I saw something that I had from one of my other radio shows and some notes that I've had. And one of the things I was talking about was they were in the beginning of the war and people were talking about Nazis and they said, no, it can't be a Nazi country. They've got a Jewish leader. And I thought, that didn't age well for a number of reasons. That didn't age well. But here's my point. That takes us over to another country that has a lot in common with the ideology, shall we say, seems to have a lot in common with the ideology of Ukraine. And now, speaking of things that are irrational, we're hearing now, Israel wants another piece of, sorry about that. Wants another piece of Iran. Oh, they're going to go back and they're going to take Iran. Well, the first time they had like a 12-hour window to attack Iran with, a defenseless Iran, and they still got the living crap beat out of them. 12 days later, they were crying uncle, begging for the United States to come in and stop this thing because they were just about out of, okay. They were getting pummeled. It was obvious. Okay. So now what we're hearing is they want some more of that. Well, part of me says, I know they do. Of course, they're Israel. They want a war with, they just war. Where Israel with who? Point us in that direction. Whatever, right? And Iran especially. But the other part of it is, Iran has had some friends, as I understand it. So clearly they've strengthened their air defense system. They already had a very, very powerful offensive missile and drone system, which Israel can't really resist. And one thing was obvious. We've learned that had they gone on a few more days, Israel would have been about it. So if you're Iran, here's what you're thinking. If I'm Iran, this is what I'm thinking this time. If they attack me, I'm going to overwhelm them the first 4 days. Rather than drag it out over 12 days and make them slowly burn up their missiles, I'm going to night and day with drones and cheap missiles and dummy missiles and everything. Night and day for 4 to 5 days. I will send more missiles in the first 4 days than I sent in 12. And they're going to be in the same position in a week as they were. They'll be in a worse position before because they used up a lot of their stuff. I'm going to wear them out early and drones and cheap stuff and really put them in a bad situation. So they're not going to have, if they go to war, they're not going to have the surprise attack. Iran already knows a lot of their weaknesses. Iran is going to be stronger. And if the U.S. comes in, they're going to close the Straits of Hormuz. They're going to, there's no question. If the U.S. attacks them, they're going to close the Straits of Hormuz, and our economy is going
to. Yeah, well, yeah, there's been talk, actually, but interestingly, I'm not hearing the talk so much from the Israelis themselves or even from the Americans, about another round in this war. I think it's inevitable. It's going to happen. Again, it's because Israel's Israel, and they can't let it go. But there are some obstacles to a second round, that have to be overcome. And I would say the first one is Donald Trump himself, because he, insisted that he completely obliterated, the Iran's nuclear program, which was civilian, but everybody's pretending that it was a weapons program. Now it may actually have turned into a weapons program now that he's done that, but that's a whole other issue. We'll set that aside. But again, he insisted that he obliterated, and he will not take any, questioning of that. In fact, the head of the DIA was fired because he said, well, my assessment, or our assessment, is that the program was not significantly set back, and you're out of here. So again, Donald Trump does not want to hear anything and he's going to insist on the obliteration. No need to do it. We finished the job. It's all over. But who knows? Somewhere down the line, they'll work on him, and they'll come up with some kind of story where it becomes, yeah, you obliterated them, but now it's necessary to re-obliterate them or something. I don't know. Well, who knows? But that is an obstacle, just Donald Trump himself and his insistence that he finish the job. And then, okay. And then there's the whole question of Israeli air defense, because there were a lot of credible reports. I don't think there's any question that they were true, that they were running out of their air defense interceptors. And I think that's probably the main reason that they wanted a ceasefire, because they were, even with the interceptors, a lot of missiles were getting through and doing significant damage. And without them, they would just be pummeled day and night. And so they didn't want that to happen. So those stockpiles were way down, and it's going to take a long time to build them up, because I think the SM-3, some of these things that they're only producing a couple dozen a year. So it's how the THAADs and the SM-3s, and I think the Israeli ones like the David Sling, whatever, that's all of those are really, they're not like the Russians. They just can't crank them out. It's I don't know how they do it, but it's a very slow process, this very slow production process. So it's going to be a while. It's going to be, I think, many months, it seems to me, before they're going to.
You got to bring something up. The Chinese have severely restricted the sale of rare earth minerals to everybody, which means that not only does it normally take a long time, a lot of countries are having difficulties getting the rare earth minerals for even the normal amount of production of a lot of military industrial items.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So that's the problem. Are they going to be willing to go into a war if they only have 3 days worth of, they had basically 12, maybe 15 days worth, and they got close enough where they called for the ceasefire. Are they going to start a war where they're going to run out in 3 days or something? Well, maybe the idea again is maybe, Netanyahu finds his back against the wall. And again, he's under a lot of pressures. There's a lot of people that hate him in Israel, unfortunately, not because he's committing genocide, but, for other reasons, domestic political reasons in Israel. And so he may just go for the, again, strike at Iran. That may be his escape route.
When you need I think the only way they can do it is they have to drag the U.S. in.
Yeah.
They can't. I don't think Israel's in a position, because what we've seen is they've been pummeled. And if they don't even have a 12-hour window, which they wouldn't this time, and Iran is stronger defensively, they go in there and they wake up the next morning, and man, Tel Aviv looks like, the moon. Looks like the dark side of the moon.
Yeah.
How long's that? But if they drag the U.S. in, I'm convinced, based on what I saw, Trump, it was reported that Trump said, something like, well, can we get in and get out? I don't want to get dragged into a long war here. Can you guarantee me this will happen real fast? And his concern was, and his base was, hey, don't drag us into a war that Trump doesn't want to get. He don't mind hitting somebody easy, but he doesn't want to get dragged into a long war. So I think there are people that are convinced it's going to happen. It's absolutely, probably within months, they may be right. There's so many obstacles here. I would be probably more surprised. I'm going to go 60-40. It doesn't.
Right. Yeah. Well, I have to confess that I was surprised by the attack. I knew there was a chance, and that's the reason I actually canceled my trip to Iran. We were going to go there, but it was too much uncertainty. He said, I'm sorry. I told the tour guide, felt really bad about it, but we just can't do this. But still, I didn't think it actually would happen. But there was a surprise. They had what was it? Operation Rising Lion, again, with the drone attacks launched from Iranian soil, and and then, I don't have to go through the whole thing. There was a surprise attack, and it was, you have to say, it was pretty effective. The Iranians were caught off guard. They suffered some real harm. And I think that's maybe this whole thing was what convinced the Americans to give the green light, and the Israelis went for it. But we'll have to say they failed. They failed to achieve regime change, and even if it's not really clear how much they were worried about the nuclear program, maybe they were, maybe they weren't. But if they were, but let's just say, for argument's sake, that failed too. Like the DIA director, I don't think he's lying to us. I don't think there was a real significant setback to that. So it failed. You have to admit it failed, and it just made the Iranians angrier. But anyway, what was I about to say?
I would call it an abject failure, but an absolute abject failure in the context of the operation, right? The plan. What's your plan, Garland? Okay, there's a big guy and he's pretty bit strong. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to walk up behind him. I'm going to bop him in the head with this bowling pin. Then he's going to fall on the ground, and then I'm going to finish him off, right? I bop him and he falls. And before I can get to him, he stands up and turns around. And I'm like, uh-oh. You know what I mean? It was, the plan was to do this and then that. So my argument is, it was a failure. Did I hit him in the head? Yes. Did he fall? Yes. Did he get up? Yeah. Is he going to beat me to death? Yes, he's going to beat me to death. My plan was a failure. So I would say it was an abject failure in that it was myopic. All we got to do is this. All we got to do is we've got to sanction the Russians and they'll fall. Right. All we got to do is we got to sneak up on the Iranians, and that we always got a plan where all we got to do is send in a bunch of people in the Bay of Piglets for Venezuela, and somehow the government will fall, and none of it works. All we got to do is we've got to start a bunch of protests in Iran because of women wearing hijabs, or some woman died in police custody, and then the whole country, those things fail. We execute the initial part of our plan, but the plan fails over and over. This country's been around for thousands of years. They ain't falling that easy. Yeah.
No, it's true. I mean, you have to look on every measure. It was an utter failure. Okay. They failed to achieve regime change. In fact, the opposite has happened. Without exception, it's just every Iranian says, oh, I can't believe it. Like, I had this friend who was always fanatically pro-Western, or, anti-Ayatollah or whatever. And now he's just like the most patriotic nationalists out there. He said, we got to go back at them. We should launch a surprise attack on Israel. Why did we agree to that ceasefire? That's what they've done to Iran. And then, on that grounds, total failure, the absolute opposite effect of what was intended. And then if you look at the nuclear program, the stated objective, and again, maybe that wasn't the real objective, but let's say the stated objective was to obliterate the nuclear program and prevent them from getting nuclear weapons. Now there's a chance that they really are going for nuclear weapons. Like, polls show in Iran that the majority of people say, hey, we should get them now. A lot of people who were, agreed with the supreme leader, let's not do this. Now they say, hey, look, this is the kind of world that we live in. This is the kind of enemy we have. We have to have nuclear weapons. And so they're angry. They're united. they've been, they have been attacked and they see a real need for it. You just probably, and the IAEA is out of there, again, for very good reason, because they were implicated in this attack. So now, before you had the most intensively monitored nuclear program in the world, that's gone thanks to your attack. So again, the opposite effect of what was, openly stated. Yeah, total failure, just a complete disaster. And now they're talking about it attacking again. Maybe they will. Again, it's just like Netanyahu, who might get so desperate, he may just go for it and just hope against hope that the Americans back him up. And there's so many crazies in the American administration. He might be right about that. But I see a lot of obstacles to this. I mean, just real hard constraints. Again, yeah, they won't have the same kind of advantage of surprise. I'm sure the Iranians have learned their lesson. That it's going to take a while to build up the stockpiles, and what are they going to do? They don't even know, I don't think, where the nuclear material is.
And that's the least of their problems in the immediacy. First of all, they don't even know if Iran has nuclear weapons. For all they know, Iran could have said, you know what, that's it. Let's make a couple. That way, when they come back after us, if they fire a nuke at us, we'll immediately fire one back. You don't know. I am not saying that Iran has nukes. I think they probably don't. But you can't bet 100% now that if you throw one at them, and I'll guarantee you this, Iran is on hair trigger. Their missiles are on hair trigger. Mm-hmm. And if they see so much as a rock come across their border from Israel, they're going to let loose on all of your critical infrastructure. That's the other part of it too. Iran didn't just willy-nilly hit parks and recreation centers. They very specifically targeted critical infrastructure, and the damage they did was exponential in that it wasn't just damage to random buildings. Mm-hmm. It was very, very carefully chosen targets that put long-term damage. So Israel probably has more long-term damage, and Iran said, we're going to finish them off this time. You think what we did was bad last time? If we're going to really let them. So what do you do if you're Israel? You wake up the next day, you got no water, you got no electricity in a small country. They decided Ben Gurion Airport has to go. That's your only international airport. We'll finish that one off on day one. You're in the Stone Ages.
Right. Yeah. Again, what is the population of Israel? Something like 9 million, so roughly like that. But anyways, it's less than a tenth of what the population of Iran is. And Iran is, is also a geographically vast country, mountains, and they have a hinterland. Okay, you may do a great deal of damage to certain cities, including Tehran, but there's a lot more to Iran, and they can keep on fighting. Now, Israel just doesn't have that any kind of buffer or margin for error. They don't have a hinterland to retreat to. They're just a couple of, there's the one international airport. There's just a couple of oil refineries. There's it doesn't take a whole lot to actually just shut down the country. That's in a way that would be impossible for Israel to do to Iran. So yeah, I mean, looking at some sort of long-term fight, it really does look bad for Israel, and I think it was looking bad. And again, that's why we got that ceasefire. I think, again, like if Netanyahu was crazy enough to go for it, and he just might be, again, he'll be banking on the U.S. to bail him out. So again, there are so many, pro-Israel fanatics in this country that if it looks like Israel's really about to lose, as they're losing a war, the pressure for the U.S. to become involved in a big way is just going to be huge. And that's, again, I think Netanyahu maybe will go into it knowing that he's going to get pummeled. But that's the thing. He says, well, let's get pummeled, and then we'll have the Americans, launching an all-out attack on Iran. But then
at that point, they close the Straits of Hormuz. See, that's the thing about it. The United States can say, okay, here's what we're going to do. We're going to swallow an economic suicide pill. We're going to fire. What are you going to do? Okay, don't worry about it, Israel. We'll swallow this economic suicide pill and obliterate our own economy, and then we won't have any money to help you afterward. Wait, what? I mean, I don't know if you've been following this, but one of the things I find interesting is, the Israeli government sells government bonds. but their economy is pretty much non-existent, so nobody would buy them. So the United States said, we'll back them with the full faith and credit of the United States. If you're buying Israeli bonds, you might as well be buying. If for some reason they can't pay, which they won't be able to, but if for some strange reason Israel can't pay, we'll cover them, right? So people continue to buy the bonds. What happens when the United States can't pay, when Israel can't pay, and the U.S. can't pay? At that point, Israel had the what is it? The parasite has killed the host. And that's basically what happens. Will the Witkoff? I remember Witkoff once saying, they said, "Oh, what do you think about nukes?" He said, "If one nuke went off, the entire financial infrastructure would collapse." Right. So, will these billionaires who have all this money in the market, in derivatives, in oil futures, and all of that, say, if they close the Straits of Hormuz, we go broke, everything. Right. It'll make 2008 look like a day in the park, right? It'll look like the Roaring 20s. So yeah, let's go ahead and do that.
Yeah, I know. You would hope that that logic would prevail and that their own self-interest would prevail, because it is obviously not in the interest of the U.S. or even the interest of U.S. business for something like this to happen. And I think that's one reason it didn't happen until very recently. But at the same time, I think the support for Israel is just not very rational. It's in the end, it is ideological at its core. And so these people, look at somebody like Miriam Edelson. I think for these people and others, mega donors to both the Republican and the Democratic parties, Israel is okay. It's not for them. It's more than just another, business interest. Yeah, they got their business interests, but now they're taking that and they're supporting the thing that they really believe in. Again, the which again for them is an article of faith. Zionism is irrational in that way, just like Western supremacism is. The two are clearly very much linked, but there's also somewhat separate phenomena. So, I looking at it again in terms of self-interest, they should be trying to avoid a war with Iran. But I don't know. Again, there's a lot of craziness associated with Israel and support for Israel. And it just, so I'm just not confident when it comes down to it that the cooler heads will prevail. They'll think through all the consequences. There are people that just want Armageddon to happen. Not just the Christian Zionists, but I think some of the Zionists in general, Netanyahu himself.
I think he uses that, but I think he's pretty much an atheist.
Yeah,
and I think he uses that because he really wants to stay out of jail. Because he's a crook. And so he uses, religion to stay out of jail. I think, but we shall see. Here's what I think. They're more likely to attack Lebanon. They're more likely to try to take more of Syria and destabilize that region. I think they're more likely to work in the area of their immediate vicinity and try to take more land, attack Hezbollah, whatever. They're like, okay, we can bomb a Hezbollah a lot and we can do things like that, maybe kill a lot of innocent people with bombs. We're really, really good at that. I think that Israel and the U.S. is more likely to bite off something that they can chew on in their local region than start this big war. Because if they start a big war with Iran and it goes bad, then Hezbollah's right on there. Then Hezbollah attacks, or everybody in the region attacks. I've heard, the PMUs in Iraq attack. If the U.S. goes into it, then, well, guess what? We lose every base in the region. I think there's a lot of reasons for a lot of people to pull the reins back. And I think they want a war, but I think they're more likely to attack Lebanon and or Syria.
Yeah. Well, there's no question. See, the thing that's different about Iran is that it can hit back. It did hit back. And Israel ended up with a bloody nose and more, really. And that's something that they're not used to. And I don't think they want to see a repeat of that. I hope, again, there are reckless elements within Israel and within the U.S. administration. Yeah, I think they're much more comfortable with, beating up on their neighbors, Syria and Lebanon. And in fact, that has never stopped. It's just like, I think Right. There are bombings in Lebanon and in Syria, just to, at least, every other day, innocent people are being killed there. And Israel is seizing more land in Syria. And that's not going to stop. I think they're very comfortable with that. And they feel like they have the upper hand. There's a push within Syria to disarm Hezbollah. And Hezbollah is not going along with it. They know what the result of that's going to be. Once they're disarmed, there's nothing stopping the Israelis from just seizing land. They tried to do that, remember, with their invasion of Lebanon, and they got half a mile in and never really got past it. Hezbollah fought them to a standstill. I mean, Israel did terrible damage to their leadership, with these decapitation strikes, but on the ground, they didn't get anywhere. So they're using the advantages that they have, with actually thanks to the U.S., which is just so deeply entrenched in Lebanon and has its tentacles, all through the different political parties outside of Hezbollah, that they're exerting pressure. They're trying to really corner and isolate Hezbollah and to disarm them. But I don't think they're going to succeed in that. But there's a chance that we might even have something like a civil war. And if that happens, Israel will probably take advantage of it. Again, I think they would be much happier doing that. It's what they're bombing people who can't really bomb them back.
Actually, I think it'll backfire, because I think what would actually happen, and there's already been warnings to the government that there could be a mutiny in the military right now. Rather than a civil war, here's the problem: like 99% of the people in Lebanon agree with the Palestinians, but their government, the 1%, doesn't. Right? That ain't much of a civil war. That's called a revolution or a revolt. So if they fire that thing up, I think it works the opposite of what they want. That the puppet government that they have falls. If they get something where they say that, and there's already been warnings from the military. Look, if we got to side with somebody, probably ain't going to be you. Okay. If this thing falls apart on them, and the people in the military that wouldn't side with Hezbollah realizes their heads are cut off if they don't, because they're in the minority, guess what happens? The puppet government for the West falls, and their heads, heads roll, shall we say, both figuratively and, other ways. Let's hope that doesn't happen. We are here on this channel. We're certainly opposed to violence, but we understand the reality of that region. But at that point, you lose everything, because now you lose Lebanon. I think that's a possibility they have to be concerned about.
Yeah, no, it's true. I know that there's I've heard a recent poll showed that, I don't know what the exact percentage was, but a majority actually supported Hezbollah. It's not just the Shia, but many others, including many Christians, that say, these are the people who have actually defended us. And so, we continue to support them.
Guess what else? Did you know this? That because of what's happened in Syria, that also the reports are people are buying weapons everywhere. Families and people are buying weapons everywhere, saying, well, if they take over here and the Zionists and the fighters from Syria and the ISIS fighters, everybody, they'll kill our families, they'll rape our women. Everybody has to be armed to protect themselves individually. So everybody's buying weapons and grenades and everything they get their hands on so that they can personally protect their families.
Yeah.
So that you're looking at now, a Venezuela style thing where you've got a gigantic country that's a militia that's going to fight to the last man.
Yeah, no, it could
win that one.
Yeah, it could blow up, and it could be bad for Israel. Yeah, I agree. But they're much more likely to go in there. I think they have a smug sense of superiority. They've Netanyahu, actually, his decapitation strikes were very popular within Israel, and they do have their eyes on that Lebanese land, especially in the south, and they've already taken a good chunk of Syria. That's. And maybe that they'll just decide. I know there's all this talk about, continuation of war with Iran. But for the reasons that we've stated, I don't see it happening soon. I might be wrong, and maybe the Israelis are so crazy or whatever, they'll just do it tomorrow. But I don't see it happening. It's much more likely they'll get involved with their immediate neighbors.
Last thing I want to ask you, I see we're just about out of time, but I did want to ask your thoughts on this. The economic report, the UK, that they're pretty much broke and they may this fall be asking for an IMF loan. France, same. Germany, same. That like the Western countries, the same countries that the yappy chihuahuas are in, which I believe is probably linked to it. They are very, very deep in serious economic trouble. Your thoughts on that?
Yeah. Okay. Well, the one thing about Europe, the Eurozone, is the euro is not a reserve, it's not the world's reserve currency. So they can't just print more euros the way that the US is doing. Now, I think at some point in the not so distant future, the dollar is going to lose its reserve currency status, and then we're going to be in a real serious fix. But the Europeans are, because they depend on the euro, they actually, they have to make difficult budget decisions. And so, for example, we had Merz recently saying, "Oh, we're going to have to cut social spending." Why? Because we got to send more money to Ukraine. And same thing, I guess, like there was this heating subsidy in Great Britain, and Starmer wanted to cut it because, again, he wanted to send money to Ukraine. They're forced to make these difficult political decisions, which are very unpopular. So they're in a fix, and now, the Americans are saying, we're not going to spend any more on this. You're going to have to spend it. But they, as these reports that you mentioned show, they're already in serious fiscal trouble. How are they going to do this? Now, Germany, I understand, they're not so deeply in debt as the others, but they're now expanding their debt rapidly. The UK and France, they're already at close to a crisis level. So how are they going to? It shows they're in a fix, but they don't show any signs of waking up to the crisis. They're still fixated. All these leaders are, they all want to be little Winston Churchills, and so they're giving these brave speeches, and making visits to Kiev and hugging Zelensky, but it's going to, very well may blow up on them, and that'll be good. That'll be good. A fiscal crisis could be what it takes to wake up Europe and to just say the hell with this.
I think you're right. I think Russia knows that time's on their side. They're fiscally stable. Their adversaries in Europe aren't, and time is on their side. And even then, the United States, I think we got some, shall we say, lean times ahead, but the United States can produce its own food. Mm-hmm. It can produce its own energy. Right. If you can protect yourselves, well, as they say, we've got insignificant powers to the north, to the north and south, and fish to the east and west. Right. It's been said about the U.S. So the U.S. doesn't need to have to worry about defending itself. Nobody's invading us. Right. So we don't have to worry about the defense part. We can grow our own food. Right. We can produce our own energy. The United States can come out like Russia. Look at Russia. Look what happened to Russia in the 1990s. But what can they do? They got energy. They got food. They can defend themselves. Russia's fine. The United States has energy and food. On a global scale, the United States can come out of it.
Yeah. Oh, agreed entirely.
Can come out of it.
Right.
It's going to take a couple centuries for Europe.
Yeah.
They got a couple centuries of humiliation on their hands.
Yeah, right. Yeah, they're already starting to call it the century of humiliation, which echoes, the Chinese century of humiliation. But it's their turn now. Which I guess there's some sort of cosmic justice there. I don't know.
How about that? When it started with that meeting with Trump. That was the opening salvo of the century of humiliation. They'll call that the day of humiliation. That is the 9/11. That is the Pearl Harbor of the century of humiliation for the Europe. From then on, it's all downhill from there.
Or maybe you could point to Nord Stream, but but it wasn't so public. That was right. They were pretending like, whoa, what happened?
This is it. Let me tell you, we're on our way out, but I'll say this. That's a fuse. That's a bomb with a long fuse. The truth about at some point, there will be new leadership in Europe. It may not be all that far away. I think the French government goes first, but there are going to be people saying, we want the truth about Nord Stream. Mm-hmm. There's a time coming in Germany when there's people that are going to say, we want the truth about Nord Stream.
Yeah, I think you're right. Yeah.
All right, thanks a lot, Peter Erickson. Peter, he's got a great channel, and it's called Conversation Amongst the Ruins.
Okay.
All right. Thanks a lot, everybody. Make sure you go there. Make sure you subscribe, and make sure you can become a channel member if you want. And click the little bell. It's a great channel. You will all enjoy Charlie and Peter. It's great. Follow me on Rockfin and Rumble and Telegram, all that stuff. I especially want to thank all my Patreon people. You're what keeps this channel going. My Buy Me a Coffee people and PayPal and all that stuff. Thanks a lot, everybody. I appreciate what you do. I do also have my P.O. box, so you can snail mail me whatever you want to snail mail me. Very much. The most important thing you can do is share this on all your social media platforms. Thank you. We're out.